All right, today we're going to talk about why endurance athletes should lift heavy stuff. It's funnier the first time. Gosh, can't even see it. So the rate of injuries in runners is pretty high. If you kind of look at per 1,000 hours, how injury rates happen versus like strength sports, which we'll look at in the next slide. 17.8 injuries per 1,000 hours of running in novice runners, which probably isn't necessarily this group, but it could be people coming back from an injury, that kind of stuff. There's 7.7 injuries per 1,000 hours of running, even in like recreational runners. It drops down a little bit for ultra marathoners. And I think just because they've got to be so efficient and there's only a certain type of person that's going to be doing ultra marathons, and they're probably a little less prone to injury while running, but it's still pretty high. Thinking about the number of hours in a year that you're running, you're going to get injured once a year is basically what this is saying. Track and field athletes, which I don't think any of us really are, but sprinters tend to fall more on that 26.3 injuries per 1,000 hours, and then more like 800 plus meter athletes tend to fall a little bit lower. But this is pretty high. And if we compare that to just strength stuff, so this is a really busy slide here, but basically these guys at the Strength and Conditioning Research blog took a whole bunch of studies, put them together, and they look at injury rate per 1,000 hours in various strength sports. So way up at the top here, my favorite sport is strongman at only 5.5 per 1,000 hours, right? Which is kind of surprising to me. But that's still lower than recreational novice runners, all of that. And then even like CrossFit, everybody thinks you're going to murder yourself doing CrossFit. That's actually pretty low on there. And so for some reason, inherent to strength sports, even like elite strength sports like Olympic weightlifting, that kind of thing, injury rates per 1,000 hours are actually pretty low compared to even recreational running. And so that doesn't mean that running is bad, right? Like running is actually a really good thing for your health. There's a recent study looking at knee osteoarthritis, and I believe it was 50 to 60-year-olds versus people of the same age that were sedentary, and there was less knee arthritis progression in runners. Same thing with intervertebral disc health in older people that have been running for a long time versus sedentary people. They have thicker discs, they have better disc composition and stuff like that. So it's a healthy activity. It just means that there's probably some aspects to it that can result in musculoskeletal injuries that are not necessarily inherent in strength sports. And so we can probably take a combination of those things and make the injury rate even lower. So greater than 80% of injuries in runners are overuse injuries, which means that tissue injury is always a difference between the capacity of the tissue and the load going through that tissue, whether it's in the moment or over time. So when the load through the tissue is greater than the tissue's ability to recover, this results in an overuse injury. And I think like the vast majority of this 80% is knee injuries. You get Achilles tendon, foot injuries, like pretty much everybody here has experienced something like that, probably, and everyone I've seen. So if it's kind of just making up numbers just to kind of explain why this is, and these are not real numbers right here, but just to explain kind of the concept. If you're doing an activity and say you're just running, and every time you hit the ground, and this isn't a made up number, but even a slow jog is about 2 to 3 times your body weight going through your leg each time you hit the ground. So you'd have to be squatting like 400, 500 pounds probably to get kind of that same amount of like peak force, right? And so what happens is that over time, if your tissues aren't very strong and they're not well adapted to this, then you might be working at a very high capacity of those tissues every time you hit the ground. And it's not necessarily like tiring for those tissues, but it's a very high amount of force compared to what those tissues are capable of withstanding. And so if you land and it's 3 times your body weight over and over and over and over thousands of times for hours, versus if your tissues are thicker and stronger and they're better able to withstand force, that same amount of force might only be 30% of that tissue capacity. And the real numbers are probably much lower. It's probably like 10%, like 5% kind of thing. But just to get that concept across, if you're doing that 1,000 times with 80% of your tissue capacity, it's probably not going to be able to recover from that very well, right? But if you're doing that 1,000 times with 30% of that capacity, it's going to recover a little bit better, and you're going to actually be able to adapt instead of just break that tissue down. And so that's kind of what we're looking at here, is this adaptive process. When a tissue experiences stress, and this happens in every tissue in your body, it responds to that stress by adapting. And that's kind of what we do in physical therapy in general, right? That's what we take advantage of. And so we stress those tissues, we stress them enough to provoke adaptation, but if we overstress them, then they can't. And that generally in runners, this means stressing them over time with high frequency. They can't adapt to that load, and so they start breaking down instead. And that's when tendinopathy happens. You'll get inflammation around a tendon. Part of that tendon will become basically less able to absorb load, and it'll start to hurt. And so when you do strength training, you can kind of work around that. Tendons become thicker, all that kind of stuff. So some of these adaptations that we need, you can't get purely from cardiovascular training and from endurance. So I already talked about this a little bit, but the greatest magnitude of positive tendon adaptations in this 2015 systematic review and meta-analysis looking at Achilles and patellar tendons found that they did like a whole bunch of different, they looked at a whole bunch of different studies. The one stimulus that they found that created the greatest amount of adaptation was working with very heavy loads, basically resistance training, 80 to 90% of the 1 rep max, right? And so this is heavy lifting. This is not running. This is not like doing little pink dumbbells, trying to like tone kind of stuff. Kind of surprisingly to me, the effect of plyometric training on tendons was ambiguous. When you do plyometric training, so this is like jumping, like all those kind of, you could probably call running a form of plyometric training, but like high jumping, things like that, there's a lot of peak force going through tendons and bones. For some reason, that does not provoke the same adaptive effect. In some studies it did, in some studies it didn't, and it's kind of ambiguous. And so for whatever reason, even though like the peak load for plyometric training is probably higher, you need that kind of slow, grindy movement in order to provoke the maximal benefit to tendon change. And so the other thing that they kind of found was that longer durations, most exercise science studies are not great. They kind of cut off at 12 weeks, they lose funding, and like there's usually not like a lot of people going into these things. So, but the studies that lasted for longer than 12 weeks found greater tendon adaptations, which is probably not surprising, right? The more you train, the longer you train, the better it gets. So you can't just like lift for a month. You'll get a little bit of adaptation, but this needs to be like a fairly consistent thing. And we'll talk a little bit about balancing that like throughout the season and kind of periodizing so that you don't exhaust yourself for the actual priority, which is endurance training right now. So tissue adaptation to resistance training, talking about bones, I just included this one because this is one of the coolest things I've ever read. There's a 2012 case study just looking at a single 48-year-old female and a 50-year-old female who were elite level powerlifters in their age group. And they found that it was the highest bone densities ever recorded in all of science for those age groups. So these two ladies who, and powerlifting is a sport of squat, bench press, and deadlift, right? So it's just lifting heavy things for a 1 rep max. These two ladies had the highest bone densities ever recorded. They're not going to experience stress fractures. They're not going to get osteoporosis, any of that kind of stuff. So I thought that was just kind of a cool thing. A 2018 meta-analysis, a really, really recent evidence here, showed that resistance training improves bone density more than other weight-bearing exercise regimens, including aerobic training and plyometrics. So generally when we're talking about bones, the like common knowledge, and I don't even know, I couldn't really find like a start to the research on this. And I think this is just one of those things that someone decided sounded like a good idea. And then every exercise science textbook since then has kind of picked up on it and called it and just run with it. So there's supposed to be this idea called minimal essential strain that bones adapt to. And the idea, and that's probably a true thing, but the idea is that bones need to experience 1/10 of the amount of force that it requires to break them in order to experience adaptation. Again, like I couldn't find any real supporting evidence for that. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but I think it's probably one of those things like the Russians made up in like the 50s and everyone was like, yeah, the Russians said it, we'll just kind of run with that. But what basically, so, because if that was the case, plyometric training would probably improve bone density more than resistance training. But for whatever reason, resistance training, heavy resistance training, 80 to 90% 1 rep max improves bone density more than other types of training, even though that peak force, like when you're landing, is still probably a little bit higher. It's just that grindy lifting that kind of does it. So far we have like tendon adaptation, so we can try and avoid tendon injury. We have bone adaptation, so we can avoid stress fractures, that kind of stuff. In regards to performance, so people might kind of be worried, you know, like every pound of body weight you carry is a pound of body weight you have to carry through 1,000,000 miles of triathlon, right? Or like a full marathon and stuff like that. So that builds up. I don't know what the math is on the triathlon, 112 something. I don't know. So a 2018 systematic review showed that it actually, resistance training in addition to aerobic training actually improves a few facets of endurance performance. And so running economy, and the idea here is that resistance training improves tendon stiffness, and not stiffness as in like I can't stretch. Stiffness is kind of a scientific measure of how much the tendon can basically extend under a certain amount of load, right? And so when your tendon stiffness increases due to resistance training, it means that you return energy better. So instead of having to use your muscles to push off, your tendon acts like a spring, like your Achilles tendon kind of acts like a spring. You land, it pushes off. You don't have to use additional muscular energy to do that. And so that means the actual run requires less energy, which means that you can either go faster and use that extra energy to go faster, or you can run for longer. And there's kind of there's a little bit of like debate over like what running economy really is and whether this is really the reason, but it kind of makes sense, I think. So time trial performance, so 1.5 to 10 kilometer time trials, resistance training actually improved performance in these, as opposed, so resistance training with aerobic training or just aerobic training, kind of these two groups, they actually, the people that did resistance training and aerobic training, even though they did the same aerobic training, did better in the time trial performances, which I thought was kind of interesting, up to 10 kilometers, which is, you know, it's not a triathlon, but it's pretty solid. And then obviously sprint and aerobic performance, because that's basically what resistance training is. It's gonna, we'll talk a little about like energy systems and things like that. But when your muscles are stronger and they're able to produce more force, it's gonna make you sprint faster, right? So you'll be able to push off better. There's some energy system stuff in there we'll get into in the next few slides. But obviously like sprints are gonna get better if your legs are stronger. There was no negative impact on VO2 max. Velocity at VO2 max, which I think is probably a more important measure for this. So the velocity people can run at before they hit that VO2 max, because that's going to directly correlate to performance a little bit better. Blood lactate measures or body composition, which I thought was kind of interesting, because it probably should, so not a negative impact, but body composition should probably change with resistance training a little bit. But the big thing there probably to take away from that body composition thing is body composition is always a combination of the training you're doing and your diet. And so if you're not eating like 5,000 extra calories a day, then you're not going to gain weight, right? So you can still control your weight. It can stay the same even if you're resistance training, and you can still experience positive resistance training adaptations and not gain weight. You don't necessarily have to like get bulky and huge and get a lot of muscle in order to experience these adaptations if you control your caloric intake and just kind of compensate for it that way. All right, this is my favorite part. Nobody else is going to listen to this. So talking about those energy systems, basically like when you kind of go through exercise science, you're basically taught there's like these three main ways we produce energy for our body. So the first is that in our cells, so all of our cells use this molecule called ATP adenosine triphosphate in order to produce energy for our bodies. And so muscular contraction requires ATP in order to happen, right? And so like your brain works off of it, everything works off of ATP. It basically provides, it breaks off into a different molecule and it provides energy in order to do processes in your body. And so in your cells, you have a small amount of storage of ATP. And then you also have this other molecule called creatine phosphate in your cells. And when ATP is cleaved, it becomes adenosine diphosphate. A phosphate molecule comes off, and the creatine phosphate comes on and contributes a phosphate molecule to that ADP and remakes it into ATP, so then it can be used again. So it kind of recycles it. Unfortunately, in our cells, we only have about 1 to 2 seconds of actual ATP stored up, right? So if you're doing a high maximal effort movement, you get about 2 seconds of energy out of that, and then you're done. Then the ATP is all used up, and then you die, because our cells can't function without ATP. That's when you die. So creatine phosphate also, unfortunately, we don't have a whole lot of that in our cells either. And so generally the idea is that creatine phosphate, when you're doing a maximal effort movement, lasts for about 10 seconds. So it's like a max effort deadlift, it's a max effort 100-meter sprint. Even a 200-meter sprint might be kind of pushing past the bounds of what that is. Then you have glycolysis, which is basically the breakdown of glucose, which is sugar. And sugar kind of cleaves off and becomes more ATP. It's kind of a more complicated process going on, but it doesn't produce by itself without oxygen. You have this anaerobic glycolysis. It doesn't produce a lot of ATP without oxygen, right? And so it's kind of this quick source of energy, like oh man, I'm panicking, I ran out of ATP or ran out of creatine phosphate, I need some other energy. I can break off I can break glucose down into ATP, but it's not very efficient and it's only going to last like a few minutes, right? And so that's like your 200 to 400 to 800 meter runs if you're doing like a max effort thing. And then where we get the vast majority of our energy from is a process called oxidation. So you can do, there's oxidation with glucose and there's oxidation with fat. And then you can also actually bring protein in and use that as a fuel source. And endurance athletes actually do a lot of that, especially like longer, like marathon, triathlon runners use protein as a fuel source as you kind of get longer into the endurance activity. But basically oxidation can create a lot of energy, but it does not do it very quickly. It has to mobilize fuel sources like fat from other parts of your body, bring it in, and it's kind of a long process to break it down. There's a whole lot of steps, and so there's a lot of molecules that can kind of become these bottlenecks for this process. And so we don't really run out of this unless you like starve to death over the period of a few weeks, but you can't produce a lot of energy very quickly, and so it doesn't power high energy activities. Unfortunately, the way I just explained it is overly simplified to the point of not really being that useful and is a little bit wrong, right? So you don't just use ATP for like a fast movement. You don't just use oxidation for like a long, slow run. All of these energy systems are constantly being used. As I stand here, most of my energy is being produced. As you sit there, almost all of your energy is being produced by oxidation right now because it's not a very high intensity activity. Every time I like move my arm quickly, that's ATP creatine phosphate, right? And so what happens then is I can do that a few times, and what happens is the oxidation, the glycolysis has to come in and restore that creatine phosphate through kind of another series of molecular exchanges, basically. And so all of these things are always going on all the time. And so when you lift weights, the reason this is relevant, kind of got into the weeds a little bit there. The reason this is relevant is because when you're running, you're using that creatine phosphate, even though we don't think of endurance running as necessarily like an ATP creatine phosphate kind of thing. We think that as a sprint, a max deadlift, a lifting kind of thing, right? But when you're running, you're using a little bit of that all the time. That brief little push off, you're going to be using a little bit of creatine there. And then your aerobic energy systems, the ones that use oxygen, your oxidation has to come in and restore that. And so when you run out of that, you can't produce as much power. And if you don't have a lot of that stored up and you can't replenish it quickly, then you'll basically be running more slowly over time. And so if you lift weights, basically what that improves, the energy system lifting improves, is that ATP creatine phosphate, a little bit of glycolysis if you like to lift a really long time. And so what that means is every single push off is going to have a little bit more pep in your step, right? And if your aerobic energy systems are good, they can restore it as it goes. And so this should directly improve performance regardless of like kind of the other stuff we talked about, just straight on through energy system improvement there. And most people probably aren't going to say like ATP creatine phosphate is that important for endurance performance. And it's probably like, that like couple percentage right at the end, but it is going to make a little bit of difference over the course of a really long race. All right. So talking about incorporating, does anybody have any questions yet, by the way? Sure. Yeah. I can't tell what I sound like. These are like noise canceling. So yeah. Yeah. Does anybody have any questions yet? All right. Then I will just keep talking really fast and roll through. So how we should incorporate lifting, basically, some general rules that I like to kind of stick by when I lift, and we'll talk about incorporating this into a broader program too for running. Taking a set to fatigue is the biggest stimulus to muscle growth that you can do with a set, right? And so rep range does not matter much for muscle growth. So we're all kind of taught, well, I don't know if everyone's kind of taught that, but if you go to a gym, you talk to bodybuilders, you go through exercise science stuff, there's kind of that general like common knowledge of like 1 to 5 reps for strength, 8 to 12 for hypertrophy or muscle growth, 15 to 20 for muscular endurance, right? It's not how that works. So it does a little bit for strength, but actual muscle growth happens across all rep ranges equally if a set is taken to fatigue. And the reason that happens is because your muscle doesn't know what weight it's lifting. It doesn't know how many reps you're doing. All it knows is that there's local fatigue happening. So when your muscles contract, there's a series of chemical processes that ATP breaks off, becomes ADP, blah, blah, blah. A bunch of stuff happens. Hydrogen ions are produced. Other metabolic byproducts are produced. And those metabolic byproducts kind of accumulate in the muscle. And so this happens with all muscle contraction, usually with an aerobic activity. So when you're running, your cardiovascular system is efficient enough to carry those byproducts away. You breathe them out, other kind of stuff happens, you get rid of them, right? When you're lifting a weight to failure, so let's say you're doing a set of curls to failure, you're lifting at a high enough intensity that those metabolic byproducts cannot be carried away by the blood vessels nearby your nervous or by your cardiovascular system, right? And so those metabolic byproducts accumulate, they reach a point, they start to interfere with muscle contraction. Your nervous system senses that, it decides, okay, that's enough. It shuts the muscle contraction down. It stops you from being able to lift, right? So where we get muscle growth from is that concentration of metabolic byproducts, that local concentration of metabolic byproducts needs to be really high. That kicks off a series of like cellular signaling that leads to muscle growth happening over time. And so that's why if you take a set to fatigue, it doesn't matter what weight you use up to a certain point. So like it kind of breaks down a little near 1 rep max, kind of breaks down a little near like if you're doing like 40, 50 reps to failure, because nobody really pushes to failure on those because they hurt too much. But if you lift a weight till you can't lift it anymore, that metabolic byproduct accumulation in your muscle is approximately the same. The stimulus to muscle growth is approximately the same, right? And so you don't actually have to go all the way to fatigue. It's just kind of a good guideline. You can usually stop a few reps short of fatigue, and the research shows that there's not necessarily much of a difference between like stopping a little bit short, but a safe bet is just to kind of go all the way there. The more sets you do, the more muscle growth you get. So if a single set to fatigue is a stimulus for muscle growth, the more times you do that, the more stimulus for muscle growth you get. And there's individual differences and kind of like training age. So if you're like a novice lifter, you probably don't want to do 20 sets to failure kind of thing. You're going to wreck yourself. But in the research so far, what we've seen is there's no plateau for how many sets you can do and still experience additional muscle growth. So like the first set is the biggest stimulus for that. And it kind of plateaus a little bit, but we've looked at like 20 to 25 sets a week per muscle group, and muscle keeps growing at least a little bit each time they add an additional set. And so what that says basically is like the harder you work, so if you work hard per set and then the more hard sets you do, the more muscle growth you get, right? So that's how we build muscle, and that's probably a little bit more relevant just for endurance athletes, because we're trying to create local physiological adaptation. We don't necessarily care that much about like nervous system adaptation. So when we're talking about strength is different than muscle growth. So strength is a result of muscle growth and how your nervous system uses that muscle. And so strength is really specific to the rep range that you train. So if strength isn't necessarily just like a 1 rep max. Strength is a performance in an activity. And so you can build strength in a 20 rep max range. You can build strength in a 1 rep max range. Depending on the weight that you lift and the weight that you practice, the muscle grows the same. Your nervous system learns how to lift the weights that you lift, the amount of load that you lift. So if you want to get really strong with 1 rep max, you lift heavier weights. If you want to get really strong with lighter weights, you lift lighter weights. For endurance athletes, we're probably looking at like pushing those heavier weights because of those other physiological adaptations we experience with the tendons and the bones and stuff like that. Yep, said that. So the other kind of thing that we want to add in is especially for if you're not like just powerlifting, right? Powerlifting is squat, bench press, deadlift. And so you want to really spend most of your time doing those 3 things. For endurance athletes who want to be resilient in a wide variety of directions. And so we want to load ourselves in a wide variety of ways. And we're not necessarily concerned about like making our bench press really big, right? We're concerned about not experiencing tissue injury. We're concerned about improving our endurance performance. And so what that means is we want to have a really wide variety of movements. We don't want to just stick to a few things. We want to kind of switch things up. We want to do a lot of single leg work. We want to do like one version of squats, another version of squats. We want to do one version of deadlifts, another, kind of just keep things kind of constantly varied. And that's going to make our bodies a little more resistant to injury over time. The other kind of thing I've been kind of doing with Brad a little bit and a few other patients is like doing abnormal movements, right? So instead of just like doing this pure like normal squat, like squatting with your knees together, and then you strengthen the inside of your knee right there, you strengthen some of that connective tissue right there. Next time you're on a trail and you land like that, you're not going to hurt your knee. Kind of, you can do the same thing with your ankle, right? So you can walk with heavy weights like that, and then the next time you accidentally roll your ankle, you're not as likely to sprain your ankle. So just making your body strong in different ways so that we don't experience tissue injury as much. That's kind of, so when we are talking about that fatigue, and I'm kind of going to kind of start with that fatiguing point. When you lift a set to fatigue, it does create a longer recovery process than lifting a set not to fatigue. And so kind of judging, but there's been studies looking at like maximal jump height and stuff like that. And so when you lift a few sets to fatigue and then you look at maximal jump height over the next few days, it takes longer to recover that maximal jump height when you lift to fatigue than when you stop a little bit short. And so when we're talking about like peaking for a race, or, you know, if you have a really long run in the next 3 days or like a really hard training day, we probably want to time our resistance training so that it's not super close to that, so that we don't completely wreck ourselves and then reduce performance in the actual training that matters to our race. And so just, you know, incorporating resistance training in a way that is probably like on your easier endurance days, something like that. And so heavier loads may also, if you overdo the volume on this, right? So if you lift like 10 sets to failure with a heavy load, that's probably going to be a little bit too much in addition to all the other stress that you're putting your body through. So stress is stress. There are different types of stress, but resistance training and aerobic training are both going to create stress on the joints of your body and things like that. And so we need to balance out how much resistance training we're doing in regards to our aerobic training as well, make sure it doesn't interfere with that. So what we're looking for is the maximum bang for your buck movements, and basically like trying really hard without overdoing it in order to not overwhelm the systems that we're using. So minimal effective stimulus for maximal results, and that's going to differ athlete to athlete. And it's not really, after you've been lifting for a while, after you've been running for a while, that kind of thing, you can kind of figure out your own body and how much you need to do. But sometimes it's good to just kind of like get a little bit of coaching to start with and just make sure you're not going to overdo it. Starting with a low volumes, like 1 set to fatigue, that kind of thing. And then over a period of time, especially like in the off season, increasing to 2 sets, adding more exercises, that kind of thing is probably the safest way to do it. You don't want to just start out like going full bore and completely wreck yourself. And then periodizing resistance training load around endurance training volume. And so what we're kind of looking at, and with Brad, what we're kind of working at here is like, got your attention. So he has a race coming up in May, right? Is that June? Okay. Pay attention. All right. So race coming up in June. What we don't want is to like really be pushing that resistance training right up to that point. So he built a really good season, or a really good base in the off season, built up a lot of strength. He worked out, I mean, you improved your squat by like, I don't know, like 70 pounds in the 5 rep max that we were doing. Like it shot up. Same with deadlift, all this kind of stuff. At a certain point, we need to back off from the resistance training and just maintain a little bit, and then probably even let it get a little bit less performance wise in order to allow ourselves to peak for the endurance stuff, right? And so it's really important to have an off season and to take that chance during the off season to resistance train. And that's when we can get the most benefit to our bodies, like that 12 to 16 week mark, and then slowly start decreasing resistance training volume, slowly start increasing endurance volume as we go into races and things like that. So you probably want like a 12 to 16 week, like this is how to lift kind of introduction kind of thing. So I think that's pretty much it. Does anybody have any questions? No?